the book of Ruth and are in this Together sermon series. If you remember, Ruth starts a lot like Job, with one disaster after another. Bethlehem has a famine, and so Naomi takes her family and they move to Moab with the enemy. And eventually, while there, her husband dies. But she's able to marry off for her 2 sons to Moabite women, but then her sons then die before able to have any children. And so Naomi decides to go back to Bethlehem, and at first the 2 daughter-in-laws are both following her, but she keeps telling them to leave her because there's no hope to stay with her. And the one Orpah does go back with her family, but Ruth will not leave Naomi's side. He makes a vow, a promise to follow her wherever she will go. And so as they enter Bethlehem, there are a few women that are there that recognize Naomi. After all these years, they see her and recognize her. And then Naomi then proclaims to them, "Call me no longer Naomi. Call me Mara. For the Almighty has dealt bitterly with me. I went away full, but the Lord has brought me back empty. Why call me Naomi, when the Lord has dealt harshly with me, and the Almighty has brought calamity upon me?" The name Naomi means sweet, while the name Mara means bitter. So Naomi is still dealing with this grief, with this trauma of losing her family. In fact, she seems to fully embrace how she's feeling by wanting everyone to call her Mara, to call her bitter. Let that to be her own identity from this point on. I've been reading a book along with this. It's called Borders of Belonging. And the book is looking at Ruth, but kind of trying to see it through the context of today. And the authors, they share a story about Judith. And Judith said that her father had died a year before. And Judith is one of 5 children. And each of these 5 have children of their own. And some of those children have children themselves. So Judith's parents had children, grandchildren, and some great-grandchildren. A few days after the funeral, there was a big family gathering, and everyone attended. The whole family, all generations were there. It was a house filled with people, noise and chatter and story and sadness and gladness at a life well lived. Judith's mother, surrounded by generations who loved her, looked at all of her children and said, "I have no one in my life now." Judith told the group the story, saying that she was tempted to say, "Man, look around. Count the generations." But she didn't. She didn't because she took a breath and realized that her mother was telling something true for that moment. It was how she felt in that moment. And Judith goes on to say, and I think that this is a brilliant quote, "We need to mourn what we've lost before we can see what we still have." And I think that's a beautiful way to give grace to somebody who is still mourning. To let them be in that moment, to be in that space and not push them to leave that space. But I feel like that's the exact spot that we encounter Naomi in this moment of her story. Like, she can't see the good of her life. She's so focused on the mourning part of it that she can't see the good. She can't be thankful for the things that she has. She needs to grieve, and she needs to allow the scales of mourning to fall from her eyes to even be able to see a little bit of the good. And part of that good is what we read in our first reading in Leviticus. Naomi went back home. She went back to Bethlehem. And at home, they had these laws that were set up to help to protect those that were in need, those that needed support. They had these things in place. So perhaps knowing these laws was part of the reason why Naomi, in this moment where she had no way of fending for herself, decided to go back home. And we'll see that Ruth will fully take advantage of all of these support systems that have been in place. And so we're going to be looking at Ruth chapter 2, verses 1 to 20. It's a long section, but I think it's kind of important to the whole setup of what's happening with Ruth and Naomi. Now Naomi had a kinsman on her husband's side, a prominent rich man of the family of Elimelech, whose name was Boaz. And Ruth the Moabite said to Naomi, "Let me go to the field and glean among the ears of grain, behind someone in whose sight I might find favor." She said to her, "Go, my daughter." So she went. She came and gleaned in the field behind the reapers. As it happened, she came to the part of the field belonging to Boaz, who was of the family of Elimelech. Just then Boaz came from Bethlehem. He said to the reapers, "The Lord be with you." They answered, "The Lord bless you." Then Boaz said to his servant, who was in charge of the reapers, "To whom does this young woman belong?" The servant who was in charge of the reapers answered, "She is the Moabite who came back with Naomi from the country of Moab." She said, "Please let me glean and gather among the sheaves behind the reapers." So she came, and she has been on her feet from early this morning until now, without resting even for a moment. Then Boaz said to Ruth, "Now listen, my daughter, do not go to glean in another field or leave this one, but keep close to my young women. Keep your eyes on the field that is being reaped and follow behind them. I have ordered the young men not to bother you. If you get thirsty, go to the vessels and drink from what the young men have drawn." Then she fell prostrate with her face on the ground and said to him, "Why have I found favor in your sight, that you should take notice of me when I am a foreigner?" But Boaz answered her, "All that you have done for your mother-in-law since the death of your husband has been fully told me, and how you left your father and mother and your native land and came to a people that you did not know before. May the Lord reward you for your deeds, and may you have a full reward from the Lord, the God of Israel, under whose wings you have come for refuge." Then she said, "May I continue to find favor in your sight, my Lord, for you have comforted me and spoken kindly to your servant, even though I am not one of your servants." At mealtime, Boaz said to her, "Come here and eat some of this bread, and dip your morsels in the sour wine." So she sat beside the reapers, and he heaped up for her some parched grain. She ate until she was satisfied and had some left over. When she got up to glean, Boaz instructed the young men, "Let her glean even among the standing sheaves, and do not reproach her. You must also pull out some handfuls for her from the bundles, and leave them for her to glean, and do not rebuke her." So she gleaned in the field until evening. Then she beat out what she had gleaned, and it was about an ephah of barley. She picked it up and came into town. And her mother-in-law saw how much she had gleaned. Then she took out and gave her what was left over after she herself had been satisfied. Her mother-in-law said to her, "Where did you glean today? Where have you worked? Blessed be the man who took notice of you." So she told her mother-in-law with whom she had worked, and said, "The name of the man with whom I work today is Boaz." Then Naomi said to her daughter-in-law, "Blessed be he by the Lord, whose kindness has not forsaken the living or the dead." Naomi also said to her, "The man is a relative of ours, one of our nearest kin." This is the story of God for the people of God. Thanks be to God. And she proclaims, "Blessed be he by the Lord, whose kindness, or hesed, has not forsaken the living or the dead." Naomi suddenly sees what she has. She realizes the blessing that Ruth is, bringing grain and food to her. And she sees God opening a path for her and Ruth to Boaz. God hasn't abandoned her. He's opening doors for her. However, though, the book of Ruth is an oddity in a lot of the Old Testament readings, because God never shows up and speaks. In most of the other passages, we see God coming and speaking and guiding. But here, God doesn't really show up. I mean, we have both Esther and the Song of Solomon where God's not mentioned at all. Like, God is not even brought up. But this one is interesting because it sits between Judges and 1 Samuel. And God talks a whole lot in Judges and 1 Samuel. But here, God's pretty quiet in this story. He doesn't speak. He doesn't present himself before this. But instead, this is where God speaks to Israel through the Torah. It is through the law that he has established, and it is through the law that all of these things are able to happen and come through. You see God kind of working because of how he's already set things up for Israel, and how that is then blessing those that are following and listening. Like the important part of the Torah that we read in our first reading, where it's really mentioning taking care of the poor and the alien. One specific law we see is when you reap the harvest of your land, you shall not reap to the very edges of your field, or gather the gleanings of your harvest. You shall not strip your vineyard bare, or gather the fallen grapes of your vineyard. You shall leave them for the poor and for the alien. I am the Lord your God. I mean, this was a great way to help those in need. They could gather the things that they needed. They could come to the fields during the harvest, and they could also then put in the work to get the things that they needed for themselves and, for their family. But I mean, this was still kind of at a cost to the landowner, because the landowner still had to leave things behind. You couldn't completely harvest the whole thing. And so if nobody came, if nobody was necessarily in that big of a need and didn't come, then a lot of that was just bought in the fields. It was bought in the ground, and it was just money tossed. And besides that, this doesn't even count for the first fruits offering that the landowners would have to donate, and then also the tithe that they would have to give as well. This is another thing on top of the responsibility for the landowner. So this came at great cost to those to kind of help care for the poor. The thing is, though, it turns out, as we read in the prophets, this practice of kind of leaving this sections of their harvest for the poor was kind of neglected over time. And in the prophets we see that the justice and care for the poor and for the alien is pushed aside as the rich keep getting richer and the poor keep getting poorer. And that's part of the reason that the prophets give for the exile, the punishment of Israel. Because Ruth is both, in this story, she's both poor and an exile, and an alien. She not only, through following this law then, that allows for Ruth to provide for herself and Naomi, she is also not afraid to work. She puts in the work all day. And by the time she leaves the field, she has about 30 pounds of grain that she takes back home with her. And the thing that it seems that Ruth's status as an immigrant, her being a foreigner, causes her to stand out amongst the crowd. People know that who she is. They know that she is the Moabite. They can tell that she is not from around there. And it causes Boaz to pay attention. Whenever he comes to the field, he notices her right away out of all the other women that are gathering in the field. And the other part of it, though, that brings attention to her is whenever Boaz hears about her care for Naomi, her loyal love that she has, that hesed that of Naomi, that Ruth has for Naomi. So last weekend, plans changed for the Alley family. We were supposed to go on a little vacation. We were going to head back down to Mechanicsburg and visit friends. We were going to go to Hershey Park. We had tickets. We were going to Hershey Park. We were going to go to some of the hot spots that we used to go to. Like Gage really wanted to go to a park that was right by our house that we used to play in all the time. He just wanted to go and see what it was like again. Like, I had all these memories of all these little places, and they just wanted to go back. And so it's going to be a fun time for all of us to kind of head back. But then I got sick. The problem was that Ty was recovering from an ear infection, Hank was recovering from being sick, Carrie was recovering from having pneumonia. Then I got sick on Thursday afternoon. Asher got sick on Friday afternoon, or Friday morning. He was kind of sick all through school and everything. And so we ended up just canceling the whole trip, and we had a little staycation instead. But that didn't mean that things were necessarily boring for us on our little staycation. And so on that Friday, Ty was outside, and he kind of came and started talking to Carrie and mentioned that he saw some kind of weird pig, fox, wolf thing. And which Carrie just assumed that it was like maybe a raccoon or a possum or something like that. He just saw a glimmer of something, and then that was it. Didn't really put much into it. But then on Saturday, Carrie was going to take the younger three to Walmart. And as they got in the car and just kind of pulled out of the driveway across the road, Carrie said, "Ty, is that it? Is that what you saw?" And he's like, "Yeah." And sure enough, it was a pot-bellied pig. Just roaming like the streets of Slippery Rock. And sure enough, it was just right there. And they went on and everything, and they saw it a couple times like that day, kind of around, and like Carrie even tried to like come close to it, see if she could get it, and everything, but it was terrified. Just absolutely terrified of her. So then on Sunday, all of a sudden I'm looking outside in our backyard, and then I noticed that the pot-bellied pig is in our chicken fence. And it is eating the chicken feed and drinking the water, chasing the chickens and the ducks all over the place, just having a blast, like just loving life down there. Carrie and Kenai, the dog, went to go and check it out as well. The pig did not care about the dog. Could care less about the dog, but anytime Carrie tried to get close, they kind of run away and everything until Kenai finally just gave one loud bark at it and then it kind of scurried off. But it just stayed in this area, and we're like, what are we gonna do with this pig? So we're trying to post it. We looked on Slippery Rock, Pets Lost and Found on Facebook and everything, and we saw somebody else post it. Hey, there's this loose pig that they saw a couple days ago, and so they posted it. So then Carrie posted, took a couple pictures and posted as well, saying, so we have it, if anybody knows who owns this pig. And so we just kind of was taking care of this pig, and it was a rainy day, but the pig made itself at home within the duck coop. We had all the hay and straw in there, and it just kind of dug underneath. I thought it was gone that night, but then I tried to put the ducks away, and they would not go into their coop, and I couldn't figure out why. I took my flashlight and I shined it in there, and sure enough, I just see a little part of a little curly tail just sticking out of the mound of hay. And so I realized why the ducks didn't want to go in. But luckily, so the pig was in there, and then the next day, the pig did not leave. The pig did not get out of the coop at all. We opened up the door, we had food out and everything. Carrie just started going down and feeding it grapes and apples, and it was just loving it. The boys were excited because they thought we were going to now have a pet pig. They named it Bacon. And so they were just having a grand old time. But luckily, we were able to find the owner, and then on Monday they were able to come and take the pig back home and everything, even though I was very, very sad about that. But I think a lot of us have stories about whenever we've kind of encountered maybe an injured animal or an injured bird that we try to nurse back, or maybe there was a stray cat that we tried to help, or an abandoned dog that we kind of took in. We do these things for these animals we don't even think really about it. Even though it might come to a lot of time or cost to kind of care for these animals, we don't even bat an eye, we just do it. Even though this pig was eating all of the chicken feed and it's causing a ruckus, we still were well, how are we going to take care of this pig? That was the biggest concern that we had, not anything else. I know we do. We also have a bunch of stray cats around too. That's true. But we don't really think whenever it comes to helping an animal, we don't really give it a second thought. We're really quick to kind of help in those times. But why is it so much harder for us then to help whenever a human is in need? Whenever people are actually struggling or anything like that, we then take a step back and all of a sudden we have to second guess everything that's going on. We don't have that same willingness to help a lot of times whenever we're dealing with people as we are whenever we're dealing with animals. And sure, a lot of it is that we don't know. We don't know the people. We don't know their story. We don't know what happened, what put them in this place or anything like that. And so we always kind of think the worst about them. We imagine we have these little stories and thoughts that we have in our head that are like the worst of the worst. This person's got to be a terrible person or whatever to kind of justify us not helping them. But Boaz, he takes the time to get to know her. He hears these stories about her, but then he invites her to come and have lunch with him. He shares a meal with her to hear her story, to find out more about her. He makes sure that she has water to drink while she's working. He tells the workers not to touch her. I mean, this was her safety to make sure that they didn't do anything inappropriate, because that was more of a risk that they were worried about at this time. And not only that, but then he's allowing her to take the crops, but not just taking those crops. He's telling the people to go ahead and pull out handfuls of the harvested grain and just throw it on the ground for her. And leave her little bits and give her extra of all of these things to help take care of her. And Ruth is then blessed because of these actions. And then Naomi is also blessed through all of these actions. And Boaz doesn't realize it yet, but it's also through this that he himself will be blessed in the near future. And it's all because he did something kind. It's because of Boaz's hesed, his loving kindness, that love that he is showing that is not standing on any kind of condition, just a general love that he's showing. See, I think we lose sight of the other. We lose sight of people. We fail to see ourselves in them. We fail to miss the fact of just a few missed paychecks, and we could be in the same position as these other people. We fail to see the image of God in them, the fact that they are beloved children of God. We fail to see that in the other a lot of the time. But we're called to care for the stranger and for the poor and for the immigrant because, for one, God just commands it for us to do it. Secondly, as the writer of Hebrews tells us, do not neglect to show hospitality to strangers, for by doing that some have entertained angels without knowing it. And finally, Jesus tells us that what we do to the least of these, we do to him. And granted, perhaps we're all just in a kind of a state of mourning, because in a way we're always kind of losing something. We're losing a loved one, or we're losing our health, our pride, our innocence, we're losing our hope, and all of these things we can spend time grieving and mourning. And maybe we need to get through a lot of those things first. But in the meantime, there are people like Ruth. There are those that have given up everything. That have given up their life, their home, their own country to protect and care for another person. And there are others that are having these hard decisions where they're trying to figure out if they should buy groceries this week or pay for medication this week. And they have a hard time making that choice. And so the question remains for us is, where is our hesed? Where is our loving kindness for the other, for the stranger, for the poor, for the widow? So may we see foreigners as neighbors and enemies as friends. May we cherish God's hesed, giving thanks to God. And may we point others to God by embracing God's unconditional love and mercy for others, sacrificing for the benefit of those that don't deserve it. In the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit.